Well, welcome everybody to our part 3 of our Lean Six Sigma series. This one is on measure. Remember, we're talking about the DMAIC platform: define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. And so what we're looking at this point in time is our measure phase. And measure is one that we all do very well. But factors to consider are your room turnover, your lead time, your maintenance downtime, any schedule demands, quality levels of care, process cycle times from beginning to end, constraints or bottlenecks, in the time frame within which you need to do orders or how you might go about what you're fed there. So thinking about all of these things in terms of what are you going to measure and how is that measurement going to work? And what is that measurement going to tell us? Really critical. So key steps in this is to create and validate the current state, identify what you have now. Can't emphasize this enough, that you need to really identify what you have currently in terms of your process. What is your cycle time? For example, cycle time of check-in to check-out. Is that 90 minutes? Is it 88.4 minutes? What is it that you actually have? And the more specific you can get, the better off you're going to be. So you want to identify your inputs and outputs, your processes, your SIPOC, and we'll talk about that as a tool later. You want to create some kind of a data collection plan, and then how you intend to analyze it, and when are you going to collect the data that you need in order to get to that baseline of your current state. And I can't emphasize that enough, again, that we have to have that. And then identify, if you can, what are the potential areas where you have some improvements. So create a data plan. Decide what data, how, when, and where. Determine what sample size you might need. Are you going to track everything? Are you going to track every 10th one? Are you going to do a random sampling? How are you going to determine what your sample size is, and who will be or what will be included in your sample size? And sources and location of data. Develop some, if you necessarily need to create some forms to help you, create a form or two to help you collect that data. And then training your data collectors. Remember, as a project manager, you're not going to be gathering all of this data. You will have a team who will be involved with it. And so make sure you're ready to execute the plan. So in the measure phase, what we're doing is we're developing this plan and we're creating this current state or a baseline. You may even think about it in terms of looking at a benchmark in terms of comparing your data to maybe what other outside sources have, or data that you've gathered year over year over year within your organization. And I think it's also a good idea to create a hypothesis. And what that hypothesis would be to help you set a goal that maybe your targeted future state, what you expect in the future, would be such. So I think that's really critical as to where we go. And then let's define terms. Full-time equivalent, a measure of sense, that's every 40 hours a week. A measure of central tendency, whether that be mean or median, and what are we looking for? You might think about standard deviations or your percentile, 50th, 25th, 75th percentile, and then of course your count. So you'll want to define the terms and make sure that you and your team members all have a good definition of the terms. A critical aspect here is that the data is valid and that it's meaningful with little or no bias, and also that it's repeatable and reproducible, meaning that when you train your team to gather it, if you're going to go to say Office A or Office B or Office C, that all three of those offices be trained to use the tools that you've put together, and that they're gathering the data that you need to have and want to have. So you're going to have qualitative data or quantitative data. And qualitative data is maybe not necessarily numeric, but it would be satisfactory or unsatisfactory. quantitative data would be numeric. So you'll want to look at how and what data you're thinking about and how you're going to use that data. And is it qualitative in nature or is it quantitative in nature? And is it going to be sampling or is it going to be continuous as to how you might look at it? So one of the fun things to think about is how many defects do you have? And how many defects do you have per unit? How many flaws? How many exceptions? So a defect could be defined as a broken piece or an error of some sort. And if you think about this, a defect could be, of course, a wrong prescription or doing a procedure on a wrong joint or something like that. It could be that obvious. Or it could be defects based on the fact that a patient didn't complete their demographic information effectively or appropriately, and that you create then what? A denial or an error down the road. So you want to take a look at how you're identifying and making sure you're dealing with your measures as possible. Now, the X and Y equation that we've seen in all the algebraic components that we've done through our training programs. X is the process or input measures, and Y is the output measures. So when you're thinking about this, if you're counting X, what is that in terms of quality, speed, cost of information, and so on? And then Y is what is the output? How well did we meet the customer expectations? The things we talked about in our previous session on define. So goal, find the X's that are leading indicators to the critical to quality outputs to Y. So what are those X's? So when you're putting your measure component together, think through what is the critical piece that I really want to have. Another key part of the measure phase is that you want to make sure that the information is, or the data that you gather is good, solid information, but more importantly, that it's actionable. You know, for example, information might be the average number of patients seen per month. Okay, that's good information. But how about the average number of patients seen by each provider per month, or each day, or each clinic session, or each diagnosis, or each level of service? Those would become more actionable kinds of things that you would want to have. Well, sampling becomes very important when you're measuring. And that is, are you going to do the entire population again, or are you going to take a look at a small sample of your population that you might have? So you want to make sure that you're taking a look at whether or not the sample selection is based on the situation or the process, number of items, and so on, the data type, whether it be continuous or some form of sampling, what objectives you have, how familiar you are, and how familiar and easy it is to gather that data. We don't want the easiest data. We want to, again, make sure that it's actionable data and that you have a certain level of confidence that the data that is going to be gathered is going to be important. So when choosing samples, you want to, judgment sometimes can be there, but there's going to be a bias that's built in. The easiest is going to be maybe not so good as well. Better to use a random sampling like, every 10th one, or use a numbering table and look at 1 to 100 and then pick a number of 1, 8, 14, 39, 72, and that would be your selection. Or that, again, you would look at every 10th one or something like that. Those kinds of things give you better results as you think through what you're doing. So the deliverables that we're thinking about in terms of our measure phase, you want to have that current state map put together. You want to have reliable data inputs, the X's, and outputs, Y, so that you have a way to get to the next phase, which we'll talk about in our next session, which will be how we analyze the data that we have. Get your baseline in place, and then be able to know that you're measuring from the baseline to your current state, or kind of where you want to go with that. In redefining potentially your definition of your improvement goals that you maybe put together in your define phase, but as you gather this data, it may help you then identify an improvement of goals as you think it through and make sure your system is capable. And as we talked about in the define phase with your project charter, it may be necessary to, change your project charter. So again, what we hope we've been able to do, and again, measure, you know the data, but you want to get the data reliable, reproducible, and you want to get the data actionable so that you can actually do something with it and that it's not just simply good information for you. So what we hope you've gathered from this session is that you define the terms, you take a look at all of the data that's available, you select the data, you find ways with sampling or in continuous process to be able to get the right data that you've got, because the data becomes very important as we move into what we will cover in our next session, which will be on analyzing the process. So I want to thank you again for joining us, and remember to continue to listen and to sign up for or to subscribe to us on our Owendahl Consulting YouTube channel to be able to make sure that you'll be able to get more and more of these kinds of things as we move forward. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and we'll look forward to chatting with you again very soon.